course on the brain. Up to this point in our course, we've been focusing primarily on sensory systems, and although there are many different sensory systems and ways that we have of getting information about our world, human beings primarily use vision and audition. So through these senses, we obtain information about the external world. We also have a somatosensory system that we covered, which is about how we get information about the immediate world, at least within our touch, and also about the world of our bodies. So the surface of our bodies and the insides of our bodies. These sensory systems are what allow us to know about an external world. We also talked about motor systems, and motor systems are the systems that allow us to act in the world. And so they allow us to have action in the world. So we take in information and we act on that. We also talked about language, and that was our last lecture. And language is just one of those functions that everyone is just intrinsically interested in. And we saw how language involved higher order sensory and motor areas. So for example, in the left hemisphere, there's a higher order sensory area referred to as Wernicke's area. And Wernicke's area is higher order sensory involved in audition. So in Wernicke's area, what's important is not just the reception of sound, but the ability to understand language specifically. So it's a higher order auditory area involved in processing language. We also learned that in the left hemisphere, in the frontal lobe, down in the inferior portion of the frontal lobe, is an area called Broca's area. And Broca's area, the frontal lobe having a lot of motor functions, the area called Broca's area is involved specifically in our ability to speak language. So it's like a higher order motor area where we're able to communicate with one another by being able to speak language. So we have sensory areas, motor areas, higher order sensory areas, higher order motor areas. And this is one of the general principles about how the brain is organized. Now, in this and the next few lectures, we're going to be talking about a very, very different system. And this system is called the limbic system. We're going to be discussing why it's called that. But it's with the limbic system that we're engaged with the world. So our sensory systems allow us to know about an external world and to take information about it. Our motor system allows us to act in the world. But it's with our limbic systems we're engaged with the world. We see, we hear, we act, but we actively engage with our limbic systems. So the limbic system is composed of a very large number of nuclei with very complicated connections to each other. It's also known as one of the integrative systems in the brain. So unlike the visual system, the auditory system, the motor system, it integrates across a lot of the other systems in the brain. And we'll see that as human beings, we don't just see something, we have an emotion attached to what we see. We don't just have experience in the world, we have emotions and memory and other things associated with those experiences. And it's the limbic system, which is that umbrella system, which integrates information in this way. In this lecture, what I wanted to focus on is the anatomy of this system. And that's because for future lectures, I want you to be familiar with a number of the terms and the nuclei and areas that we'll talk about in a great deal more depth. I also would like you to see how the concept of a limbic system came to be, because this is one of the more interesting aspects of sort of a historical view of neuroscience in general. Then we'll talk about just a few of these nuclei, a few of their connections, and again, when we talk about them more specifically, I'll come back and I'll reacquaint you with these nuclei. Right now, I want you to have a sort of general appreciation for this system anatomically. But one of the things I'm going to ask of you is on a different level. As we talk about the limbic system over the next few lectures, I honestly want you to think about something important related to this system. I want you to constantly think about how the limbic system affects your own life. because this is the system in the brain that adds enormously to our lives in a way that allows us to experience pleasure, for example, to enjoy doing things like taking a course and learning new things. It adds what might be called an emotional texture to our lives. And so this is a system that we should all celebrate. It allows us to remember events that have taken place in our lives. We're going to see that there are disorders that can take this away from us. And one of the reasons these disorders are so devastating is because, in fact, they remove elements of the limbic system. It's this system, this limbic system, which is going to give each and every one of us a unique personality. Each one of us engages with the world in a unique way, and it's the limbic system that allows that. And so, excuse me, as we talk about the limbic system today, as we talk about the anatomy and some of the functions, I want you to think about this system in this more global sense and how it contributes to your life. So let me begin by giving a modern definition of the limbic system. The limbic system is a system of complexly interconnected nuclei and areas involved in learning, memory, emotion, and executive function. Wow, that's a lot of things. So it's this huge system of complexly interconnected areas. Now, in this definition, I have included executive function. And I have to tell you, we have to attach a little writer here. I don't think all neuroscientists would agree that executive function should be placed here. But I've put it here, and I think by the end of this series of lectures, you'll understand why. I've placed it here because executive function, our ability to make decisions, particularly decisions that are in our own best interests, have a lot to do with emotion and memory, have a lot to do with how we learn things and what we've learned. And so more and more in neuroscience, there's accumulating evidence that, in fact, all of these functions are interrelated. So for our class here, I'm just going to place executive function in with learning, memory, and emotion. So how did it become recognized that a single system subserved all of these various functions? And again, this is just one of the more interesting things about the history of neuroscience. Well, in 1878, the French neurologist Paul Broca, and yes, the very same Broca of language fame, identified what he believed was a separate lobe of the brain, and he called it le grand lobe limbique. And so he identified on the medial surface of the hemisphere a number of structures that seemed to be particularly involved in emotion. Now, Broca was, of course, a very famous neurologist, but he was influenced by what was going on at the time, just like any other scientist is. And so they had identified frontal lobe and parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and neurologists were very interested in trying to assign functions to these various lobes. So in identifying a number of structures that appeared to be on this medial surface that played a role in emotion, it was logical that he would attempt to give it a name like a lobe. And so he named it the limbic lobe. The term limbic arises because, remember, we have two hemispheres in our brain like this, and this is the medial aspect of the hemisphere, and so it's the limbus, or the edge or border. And so he named it le grand lobe limbique because it was at the border or the edge of each of the hemispheres. Now, this terminology is not used in modern neuroscience. We don't conceive of the limbic system as being a separate lobe of the brain. Nonetheless, Broca was correct that many of the structures that are going to be involved in learning, memory, emotion are going to be located on this medial aspect of the hemisphere. The next development came in the 1930s, and this is when a comparative neurologist came on the scene who had done some just fascinating work. This is James Papes, and a comparative neurologist is a person who looks at the brains of different animals and compares them to see what's similar between them or what's different about them. remember that Papes would have been operating at a time in which Brodmann's areas had been discovered. And so when I was a student, I actually used his book in comparative neurology to look at the brains of dogs and cats and cows and other animals, baboons, other animals, where there was an attempt to identify what areas of the brain were the same in all these different species. So, for example, an area 17 can be found in all mammals. And so this was an exciting time for comparative neurology. And James Papes noticed that there were a lot of areas that were involved in addition to this lobe that Broca had identified. And so he put forth that there was a limbic system. And so again, he was being influenced by the time and what was known at the time. And part of that was that the brain could be divided into these systems. So there was a visual system, there was a motor system. And so he decided that since more areas were involved than Broca originally thought, and there were more functions that were involved. It wasn't just memory, like Broca had thought, but there was learning and memory and emotion. And so all of these were tied up together, and so he decided to call it a limbic system. Now, Papes also identified one particular pathway or circuit which is still recognized in modern neuroscience, and it's called the Papes circuit. And it basically tells us some fundamental things about how the limbic system works. So here we have the hippocampus being one part of this famous circuit. The hippocampus involved in memory, connected to part of the hypothalamus. It doesn't matter about the specific names, but connected to part of the hypothalamus, and then to nuclei of the thalamus that are related in this circuit called the anterior nuclei. And we know that many of the nuclei in the thalamus project a cortex, and he identified an area of the cortex that received the projection from the anterior nuclei, and then he found that this cingulate gyrus projected back to the hippocampus. I give this to you not because we're going to focus on every detail of the anatomy, but to give you an idea that this is how the limbic system in general is organized. It's organized into complex circuits that feed back on themselves. And so this is going to be a very, very important concept. And we've seen this before when we talked about the extrapyramidal motor system. Another very complex system that's made up of a large number of nuclei that are connected in these feedback loops. In the motor system, it's so the moment-to-moment action can be monitored by the brain, and with connections to other areas, changes can be made in movement. But here in the limbic system, we have, for example, just in this Papes circuit, we have one of the circuits in the limbic system where memory and emotion can be related to one another. So there's a constant feedback circuit that's going to allow the moment-to-moment regulation of mood. So from one moment to another, your mood is being monitored by these circuits in the limbic system. We have other circuits that are going to compare present experience that you're having with past experience. We have other circuits connected to that circuit, which is then going to add an emotional coloring to that experience. So we don't just remember things, we have an emotional coloring that comes along with it. And also, as we have experience in the world, our experiences become colored emotionally. So for example, if in general, when I give a lecture to a class, I have positive feedback from students, then the next time I get up to talk to the students, then I will have already an elevated mood because I anticipate that there'll be a positive response. So all of our experiences are colored by one another, and it's through these kind of complex loops, anatomical loops in the limbic system that this comes about. Now, limbic system has in fact stayed with us, so we do use those terminologies. But beginning in about the late 1950s until the present time, we've just added more and more nuclei to the system until now the limbic system is perceived as this huge mega system involved in this variety of functions, a mega system with all of these individual subsystems within it. And all of these nuclei, where they may form circuits like a PAPE circuit, all of those areas of the PAPE circuit also communicate to other areas of the limbic system. And so this is just a really active area of research in neuroscience, just wonderful. So we can't possibly cover all of the areas and all of the pathways, and we wouldn't want to do that. Even my medical students don't want to do that. What we would like to do, however, is to look at a few that we're going to focus on later so that you can understand some general principles again about how the system works. So let's look at a basic drawing of this medial surface of the hemisphere. Because it's this medial surface of the hemisphere, Broca was correct. Many of the structures that are involved in the limbic system are in fact located in the medial aspect of the hemisphere. So we aren't going to talk about every one of them, but I want you to just get an idea about this. This is the front of the brain. This is the back of the brain. So if we look down here, we see that there are areas, an area called the ventral tegmental area. We're going to be talking about that. There's a structure called the amygdala, the nucleus accumbens. Parts of the cortex are going to be involved. And that really shouldn't surprise you at this point in the course, because if we have any kind of conscious appreciation of emotion or any of these other things we've been talking about, then it comes about because of the involvement of the cortex. You don't have awareness without your cortex being activated. So the limbic system, these are just a few of the nuclei, but many of them are, in fact, on this medial aspect of the hemisphere or very nearby. So let's talk a little bit about some individual ones. The hippocampus. The hippocampus is actually the medial part of the temporal lobe. It means little seahorse, and that's because of its shape, and it really does look a little bit like that. It's our old three-layered cortex that we know is critically involved in learning and memory. We're going to be discussing the hippocampus through a variety of our lectures in this course. Another structure which is nearby the hippocampus is the entorhinal cortex. And this is Brodmann's area 28, and again, we can't see it here on this medial surface, but it is a very important area that plays a role, again, in learning and memory. And the entorhinal cortex is neocortex, and we will learn that it is one of the very first areas that undergoes degeneration in Alzheimer's disease. And it's the degeneration of the entorhinal cortex and hippocampus that result in the massive loss of memory in individuals with this terrible disease. Another nucleus that we're going to be looking at is the amygdala. Amygdala means almond shape. These old guys gave these descriptive names to things I think is pretty neat. The amygdala is not really just a nucleus, it's a nuclear complex. And it would be located underneath the cortex of this temporal pole. So it's a subcortical area located inside, underneath the cortex in the temporal pole. The amygdala plays a critical role in the processing of emotions, and especially we will see of fear, and also plays a role in emotional memory. Now, one of the areas that we will focus on will be the ventral tegmental area. And the ventral tegmental area is just a very small group of neurons that's located in the midbrain. And so it would be in the ventral portion of it, a small nucleus which has a very big effect in man and has been a very critical player for modern neuroscience and our understanding of the brain and functions like addictions, drug addiction. Speaking of drug addiction, one of the targets of this little ventral tegmental area is the nucleus accumbens septi. And this is going to be a rather large forebrain nucleus which is critically involved in any type of addictive behavior. And we will be looking specifically at the nucleus accumbens and the information which has been generated about that. Another area which is located on this medial surface is a gyrus immediately above the corpus callosum, so it would be right here, the cingulate gyrus. And while this is an active area of research, we really won't touch much on it. Many psychiatric disorders, in fact, are related to lesions that are found in the cingulate gyrus. The hypothalamus, when we've spoken of the hypothalamus in the past, we've spoken in terms of homeostasis, and of course it plays a role in that. But when we are under some kind of emotional state or in an emotional state, we also have body responses. We blush when someone says something that we interpret as embarrassing. When we're angry, our face turns red. So we know that the hypothalamus, with its autonomic outflow, is actually part of our limbic system. Now, there are two areas of the cortex which are very important in the limbic system. One is called orbital frontal, and so it would be right above the orbit of the eye. And this orbital frontal cortex is involved in impulse control, inculcation of cultural mores, and the ability to appreciate the consequences of one's own actions. So we'll see what happens when that area of the cortex is damaged. And lastly, there's an area here on the dorsolateral surface in the prefrontal cortex, which is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and this is the area predominantly involved in executive function. And I've included it here with our limbic system because making executive decisions, prioritizing behavior, adapting to change and everything is going to involve great influence from limbic system structures. Now, it's clear that the idea of a limbic system is an evolving concept. And I've tried to give you a little bit of a feel for the structures that are involved, but also how our ideas about the system have changed. Interestingly, the awareness that there was a system that was involved in learning, memory, emotion, and if you include executive function, ultimately came about because of two very famous and very tragic clinical cases. And so I'd like to tell you about those clinical cases. The first is the very tragic case of Phineas Gage. Many people have heard about Phineas Gage, but I thought I'd tell you a few things maybe you didn't know about him. He was a 25-year-old railroad foreman and dynamite worker who in 1848 survived an explosion that blasted an iron tamping rod which weighed 13¼ pounds and was 3 feet 7 inches long and 1.25 inches wide through his frontal lobes. He never lost consciousness. He never lost consciousness at all. But before the accident, Gage was very well liked. He was very respected. He was 25 years old and he was a foreman. He was described as being a very affable individual, very easy to get along with, and very reliable and dependable. Clearly, he was very highly thought of by his men and by other individuals. After the accident, he showed profound negative personality changes. And co-workers said, Gage was no longer Gage. And this is the most fundamental thing about what happened to this man. It was like he had somebody else inhabiting his body. His physician, whose name was John Harlow, followed him. And 20 years after the accident, he gave this as a description. So this is a publication in 1868. The equilibrium or balance, so to speak, in Gage, between his intellectual faculties and animal propensities seems to have been destroyed. He is fitful, irreverent, indulging at times in the grossest profanity, manifesting little deference for his fellows, impatient of restraint or advice when it conflicts with his desires, at times pertinaciously obstinate, yet capricious and vacillating. Gage was no longer Gage. This is truly a tragic case because Gage's remaining part of his life was very tragic. He could no longer hold a job. He was homeless, had no friends. At one point, he was a freak in a sideshow at the Barnum Circus in New York. He died at 1861 at the age of 38 from status epilepticus. He developed seizures as a consequence of his brain damage and ultimately died from that. One of the most important things I have to say about Gage's case, however, is that the significance of what had happened to Gage in terms of what it meant for how the brain was organized into systems was not recognized at the time. And this is what's most important about this. In fact, at the time, the conclusion was drawn from Gage's clinical case that the brain was not divided into functional systems. And the reason for that was because individuals like Broca and other individuals had all started identifying areas that were involved in the motor system and in language, yet this had gone through Gage's frontal lobe and he could walk and talk just fine. So individuals who didn't believe in a localization of function used this to demonstrate that, in fact, localization of function wasn't true. And even his own physician, Harlow, said at different times that he thought it was really good that that bar had gone through an area of Gage's brain that didn't make any difference, that didn't matter. Now, this is really important. At the time, individuals could not consider that personality and ability to engage your morals in order to guide your actions, that these sorts of things could be localized to the brain. Now, this harkens back to what we talked about in the very first lecture in this course, that it used to be that the soul and the mind were seen as a single entity. Even your ability to see things or perceive things in the world had to do with the soul and mind, which was really a single entity. Then later, mind was separated out from the soul, and mind became, well, you know, you perceive things, you see things through vision. These sorts of things may be controlled by the brain. But notice that soul was still kept separate. And in fact, individuals at the time believed that these kinds of things like personality, morality, and everything were a function of the soul. Therefore, they didn't see the significance of Gage's personality changes. Now, Gage had lost something very fundamental to his humanness. There's no doubt about that. He was no longer an enculturated human being. He was no longer a social being who could live in the world. We now know that the area of the brain that was damaged in Phineas Gage is the orbital frontal cortex. Plays a critical role in the abstraction of rules of social conduct and mores. Moreover, we now know that the ability to utilize these rules, particularly in social and personal realms, requires that these areas be intact. And these are specifically the areas that were damaged in Phineas Gage. Our last example is also very tragic, a clinical case. And it is one of the cases that led to our understanding about the role of the hippocampus in short-term memory. The patient was an individual, HM. He underwent a bilateral medial temporal lobectomy for epilepsy in the early 1950s. Now, mind you, this was after Papes had identified his Papes circuit and everything. But apparently, doctors were completely taken by surprise when it turned out that after the surgery, HM was completely amnestic. And initially, he couldn't remember anything from his past, and he couldn't learn anything. So he had what's called global amnesia. And this took the doctors completely by surprise. Over time, HM has, and he's been followed for 4 decades, by the way. Over time, he's been able to remember some things from his past. He has regained some motor skills, but he has no ability at all to learn new material that allows you to get along in the world in a normal way. So motor skills, he can learn a little bit, but he is completely unable to remember something like someone's name if he meets them. So there are famous films that have been made of HM. He lives in a room and he's monitored 24 hours a day. He can't be allowed out of the room because he can't remember how to get back. He can't learn anything that's new. If he's allowed rehearsal, he can remember something for a very short period of time. Basically, what happened in this case, and this is what led to our discovery and our recognition, that memory, particularly memory, a short-term buffer that's necessary for the person to go on and establish long-term memories, is involved with these medial temporal structures that are part of the limbic system, and most importantly, the hippocampus. Thank you.